Blade Runner as the last analog science fiction movie made because we didn't have all the advantages that people have now. And I'm glad we didn't because there's nothing artificial about it. There's no computer-generated images in the film. The things that pervaded us during the whole production was, how do we pull rabbits out of hats here? How do we do more for less? I was remember them coming off going, wow. I mean, they nearly got me involved in special effects at Big Lip.
It was plain old-fashioned filmmaking with C-stands and gaffer's tape and running the big 65 millimeter cameras.
In retrospect, this is probably one of the last great in-camera special effects movies ever done.
In the late 70s, there was kind of a resurgence. As far as visual effects went, it was like a rebirth because there's a large void, decade and a half before that. There were effects in some films, but there wasn't enough infrastructure to do a large film, like in Star Wars or Close Encounters.
The ground was changing, you know, suddenly we had motion control cameras and suddenly computers had reared their head. But as we were doing Blade Runner, I did have personal connection with Dougie Trumbull and Richard Yuricich, and I know I had a part in persuading Richard, you know, to do the movie.
It was a very small film at the time. It was about $2 million. It was about 50 or 56 shots.
They had based it on doing a like number of shots to Alien, which really wasn't enough for this film. And the more Ridley got into it, the grander his vision, I think, expanded.
Once they saw what could be done, and some of the demonstrations of the fine work that was there, of course, it would be any kid's desire or any good director's desire to just do more of the same, to actually say, wow, if we can do this, then we can also do this.
So there was always the business part of it barking at our heels. Well, how much can we spend? How much time do we have? But little by little, we got on board.
It's not like spend all the money you guys have and make it look as good as you can. It was like do more with very little money and very little time. And that was kind of fun.
Well, part of what really worked for Blade Runner was the fact that we were all stupid and didn't know too much, so we had to figure it all out for ourselves. Some of the choices that we made then I would never have dared make now, although they're actually good choices.
The thing that made our work in Blade Runner fit the movie was that we worked to the concept. And you never design a visual effects shot to have the audience go, oh wow, what a neat visual effects shot, what a great design. It always has to tell the story. And fortunately, in the case of Blade Runner, one of the protagonists was the city, was the environment. People had to live in this very oppressive environment, and that is one of the key characters in the story.
The good thing is that there was pollution as part of the story, and not pollution's not good, but there was going to be lots of aerial perspective and haze, and that was all part of the scene.
What's called a forced perspective image. You have larger little miniature elements in the foreground, smaller ones, going all the way back to the horizon. And from the camera to what appears to be the horizon is only about 15 feet. And it's just a plywood table that's about 20 feet wide at the back, but only about 5 feet wide at the front because the field of view is looking out. So you don't build anything an inch outside that field of view. That's just wasted money and wasted time. So we designed it for the focal length of that camera lens.
Mark Stetson and his crew had developed a very good system of photo etching.
Basically, you would do very intricate drawings, and then that would be applied photochemically to a piece of brass, and then they would apply acid to it, which would eat away the areas where the lines weren't. So you get this really fine filigree detail that really, really is nice. And all those spires, you just draw kind of a side view of all those, and then you can replicate hundreds and thousands of them very, very easily with the etched brass.
Even though the acid etched brass components are two-dimensional flat cutouts, if you put enough of them together, you kind of imbue it with more three-dimensionality than it's really there. Yes, I like to see what the lighting was. And I pushed hot smoke.
You're shooting things that are only 10 feet away from you, and it has to look like it's 2 or 3 miles. The only way to build up the sense of aerial perspective at that time was to fill a miniature room full of smoke and create things blurring off and graying off into the distance.
You have to be in the camera. And that's when Doug came in and again put his brain to it, saying, I know what to do. Again, he went out and did a lash up with fans, electric fans, smoke detectors, and we absolutely tented in the area with black drapes and then plastic so we contained it. And then the smoke detector would sense that the smoke was dropping in the room, would trigger a puffers that would puff smoke into the room, maintain level in the room. Because if you're only doing frame by frame animation, which was what we were, then you're going to get flicker because the smoke's going to vary. It's going to flutter. And there was no flutter. If two towers were only 3 inches apart, but there was still a lot of smoke in there, they would separate from each other. One would be a little more crisp and the one behind it would be a little darker, and the lights on the one behind would create an edge. And it would just take on this a huge amount of scale. And there's kind of a magical point where the smoke density gets to be so dense that the horizon almost disappears. That's kind of where you get to the magic point, where you suddenly get all the separation between these little cutout layers.
I just had this scheme. I just wanted to do it as a series of silhouettes in smoke. And I wanted the smoke to really be the light and the light to light it up. Everything about that miniature had to be lights.
I think it was 20,000 fiber optic light tubes coming up into all of these points. And in the foreground, we had some towers that were about this big, and we set them in there and set little interactive lights on them, because nothing exists in space without reflection and light affected by everything else.
And that really started to bring it to life. It still looks pretty crazy to look at. But, like I said, we were stupid back then. And it worked.
One of the things about the Hades landscape is that it is almost totally abstract, and so you don't have a lot of cues to tell you how big it's really supposed to be. And we had this idea that there would be these kind of smokestacks, you know, like venting burning flame gas off of some cracking plant or something. And that was one of the elements that really added a lot of scale and a lot of excitement into that miniature.
Doug had previously shot these huge explosions of flammable material, big fireballs, and he had those on 35 millimeter. We took those and put little white cards in the back of the tower and literally just projected with a 35 camera and then rephotographed with our 65 camera that explosion in place, in situ.
So for every explosion, that's another exposure through the camera, so the camera has to do that shot over and over and over. They're all camera superimposers onto one piece of film. That open shot, I think, had 17 houses. So you ran it, stopped, wound it back, ran it again, wound it back. Very tricky work. If you make one mistake, you have to start over. And that's where guys like Dave come in and make that magic happen.
Different time for visual effects. It was all optical composites, and quality was a major concern.
When you rephotograph something like you would in a still photo, if you have a negative and you take a snapshot, if you take a snapshot, a new negative of that snapshot, which is what you're doing in opticals, you'll notice that there's a little loss in quality. It's called one generation away.
Back then, every time you did an optical composite, it lost quality. And at EEG, they used 70 millimeter film to shoot the elements.
So when you degrade that optical, when you add imagery together on a large format, you do lose quality. But if you start with a large format, that quality cuts more easily with the original.
And many times, instead of doing it as an optical composite, we would do multiple exposures, which was risky because you'd shoot one pass, roll the film back, shoot another pass, roll the film back. And I remember a couple times they'd open up the camera and there'd be nothing but shredded film inside.
You know, recently finished Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Blade Runner was the beneficiary of having all that equipment already in place, all the lenses, all the cameras, all the motion control. It had all been worked out.
We were working with tools by today's comparison that were very crude. Just a program of moves sometimes would take all day long because it was done with a system almost the same as Etch-a-Sketch. You'd sort of mark a trajectory and then mark another one and mark another one, and then run a motion test with a black and white reversal film, no such thing as a computer video at that point, and then process it and look at it and go, well, that was all wrong. What were we thinking? And go back and, you know, and after a while it became clear to me that we had to previs in our heads.
We had learned to work that way with Doug because of his use of the smoke room and how much that obliterated detail. But it was so totally dependent on light that miniatures really became like substrates for light. Dave Dreyer, when he came on board, had the same philosophy. He said, if there's a problem, solve it with light.
There's a joke. I'll start with the joke. If it doesn't work, try crop it, flop it, or drop it. If none of those work, add a flare. That's just a joke. But the flares, a lens flare is something that's exists in the lens. It's in nature. Well, it's something you can't make. You don't draw. It happens in the lens.
And every camera lens has its own characteristics, but when you overexpose this source of light, like about 10 f-stops, that's when the flaring starts to happen, when light starts bouncing around inside the glass of the lens.
We just focused on that, and of course it adds that element of truth, realness, credibility to some of the imagery.
Of course, one of the challenges of this show was it was very different than, like, let's say Star Wars, where everything was kind of a matte finish surface. The spinner is just completely glossy, like a car, which means you have a lot of reflection problems, and technically, for visual effects, a lot of problems pulling max.
It had a bunch of lights on it that were great. They were wonderful. And we started shooting it, and we started putting it against backgrounds just as tests. We weren't not necessarily even the backgrounds that it would go against. And it just looked like a big hunk of junk just hanging up there in space. There's no magic to it. So I asked the guys in the engineering department, what's the brightest fiber optic light? Well, we got the xenon thing, and it'll just blow your lens away. And we ran that huge fiber optic right up to the top of the spinner, and at the end of every pass, we take a long pass with that bright light there. And as soon as we put that light in there, it just blew everything away. It solved the technical problems, but more importantly, that thing became magical.
The base of it was about 8 feet square at the base, tapering up to an opening that was about maybe 2.5 feet wide at the top.
We knew that we were making a mega structure supposed to represent something as big as an entire city. And we thought, well, let's light it single source like a big light box.
And so it was decided to construct it out of clear plexiglass. The detailing that was put on the outside was also cast in clear. So basically you had a big light box, and then we sealed it with paint and scraped off the paint where we wanted the windows to come through.
We only built that one pyramid with only 2 sides on it. So you had the front side and one side. And then we would flip it around and shoot it again. So it seemed to be 2 pyramids, but it's really only half of one pyramid.
And we backed it up with ribbing where we could, but we really wanted to keep it as open as possible on the inside so that we could light it with a big bare bulk 10K in the middle of it, 10,000 watts of light, which altogether generated a lot of heat. So when it was to be shot on stage, in those days, motion control being a very painstakingly slow process, each shot would take hours to film. That means the lights had to be burning constantly during that time. And after all the required shots were done, we were still shooting backgrounds for cityscapes, just for some of the wide views of the city of Los Angeles in 2019. And everybody thought it would be a great idea to turn the thing upside down and make this big cantilevered city shape that would be somewhat of a complement to the Tyrell Pyramid. So we rigged it like that, but didn't pay very close attention to the ventilation of it, and the thing finally caught fire during filming, and it was really ruined.
It wasn't as dramatic. We heard in the model shop, oh my God, it caught on fire, and they were filming when it happened, but it did indeed melt, and luckily it was toward the end of the shoot, so it wasn't that big of a disaster.
During that early era of new visual effects, people were not specialists. So the model makers were painters, the painters were model makers, and on Blade Runner that was the case.
When you approach a model, you look at the drawing, the illustration, and kind of break it down in its component shapes. Sometimes it was clear that you'd have to create a piece because it was very specific. And other times, if you had a rectangular piece with some sort of detail on it, you go, oh, well, I know a model kit that has that piece in it, the Revell Jet F-18. So it was kind of figuring out your component pieces, putting them together, and constructing them in a way that looked like they belonged together. And knowing what they had done on the sets, we had photographs, and then later in the production actually went down while they were shooting and saw the sets, and once again you see it and you go, oh, okay, I see. everything's got this gritty look. It's dirty, it's nasty, it's leaking, it's corroded, and we applied all that to the miniatures as well.
We learned early on that even though we planned to work at a certain scale on the miniatures, that really wasn't going to work. What we had to do was work the same way that Ridley worked. You go into a large stage, take the brightest light you've got, shine it back at where the camera sits, and then start putting stuff in front of it, and add lots of smoke into the room. And so I started posing miniature shots that way, and that's when it really started to happen.
When you build something in miniature and you build it at a very small scale, you have to be very careful. So they look real, so they look large in the mass and the speed that you shoot them with. And one of the things that first goes is the detail. If your detail isn't beyond what's good, as it loses resolution, it falls apart. So the paint job turns out to be the most important thing.
One of the things I realized in the beginning was that 50% of what you do, you never see anyway. So you have to be pretty heavy-handed with it. So when I work with miniatures, I try to make them look as visually realistic as I can, and then I add 25 or 30% heavy-handedness on top of that because the camera's going to lose that.
We started out with a set of buildings, about a dozen buildings, that were meant to be this retrofitted old base of the city.
Most of them were only two-sided buildings, the front side and the oblique side, which were miniatures on plywood with lights inside the windows and a lot of detail on the outside.
One of the main miniature sequences that was in the show when I first came on was the flight through the buildings. And a lot of time and effort was spent on laying out the buildings, what the detailing was on them for that sequence, because everyone knew that it was going to be what was outside the windows in the spinner. It got to the point where those shots grew and became more and more vast. We were using anything we could to represent buildings.
No budget for something, you can't build something else, so you borrow it. God, you just throw it in there. If it looks okay in the distant and lots of smoke, and hey, let's do it. Just put it in there.
We grabbed other things that weren't even buildings. Spaceships from another movie with a bunch of antennae and stuff glued on it. And we took the flying buttress wings on the pyramid itself. We would take those because they were all separate and bring them together and create a building. There's even a kitchen sink in the back of one of them with a bunch of stuff glued on it.
There were some purpose-built buildings that were different from this building set. The precinct tower was the main one. And they were sort of off-scale and forced perspective scale things, and they were really just a lot of fantasy shapes. And to save time, we just thought, well, let's start with something, and we started with the roof.
Once again, it was a hybrid building that was constructed out of pieces that were left lying around. The top of it is actually a piece from Close Encounters Revised Edition, where Richard Dreyfuss goes into the mothership and the ceiling lifts off. And that was the ceiling piece that eventually became the top of the police station.
What most people are amazed at, a lot of those sets were no bigger than 12 feet by 12 feet.
We weren't shooting on very large stages. And this one shot spiraling down onto the roof of the precinct tower, and we wanted to get the camera up, and the camera simply wouldn't boom up that high either. So we brought the whole miniature down to the camera basically by tilting it up to an oblique angle on its side so that the camera could reach high enough to get that aerial shot and be far enough back from the tops of the building at the same time.
There that evening we went out to do that plate, and the crew was so busy and so difficult, and every piece of equipment was used, and there was cable running everywhere, so that when they left the interior of the Bradbury building, it was dark, it was turned off.
And we didn't have time to light that whole thing looking up with the staircases and the elevator and up to the skylight and everything.
So we found an angle for that shot, the camera was set up, and Douglas said, just fire when I say so, and I didn't know what he was going to do. He marched through the building and illuminated the building in pieces. So we'd take the lens cap off, and he'd say, fire, and he'd fire the strobe, and that amount of exposure with maybe 20 strobes would go to the 8x10.
And that built up the exposure that gave us the upshot. And then John Wash and Company mounted that on a large piece of glass and cut out every one of those windows on a mullion. And then that set right in front of the blimp.
That we just put the miniature blimp behind there, and all the light effects coming through the glass were happening right in front of the camera.
The shots looking up through the skylight of the Bradbury building with that blimp going over, it's breathtaking, and I don't think it's been surpassed. I mean, you talk about digital effects looking real or impressive. Those shots of that blimp going overhead, when it's against the miniatures or when it's against that Bradbury skylight, with the shafts of light cutting through, that's inspiring. You know, it's just beautiful. Case of some of the visual effects work on that movie, we used a process called matte painting. And matte painting is a technique that is used to alter the look of a location or a set in a motion picture, and mostly is a process that is done in post-production. So it's a combination of painted artwork and live action photography.
That is even beyond digital. I mean, it's better than anything because it's photography that is shot at the same and exposed at the same time. The matte painting is exposed with the live action photography, so it just is on one piece of film.
So everything I did was kind of a lock-off. And Matt Jurisic, the matte painter, was the brother of Jurisic, the special effects cameraman.
There are a lot of technical issues that go into matte painting to make it look real, and that's where the real matte painting art comes in. Certain colors photographed differently. You have to work in certain densities to produce the effect of depth and everything. And Matthew was a genius at that and could achieve that.
And one of his unique skills was painting for dupe stock. It's a very kind of hard thing to understand, but in order to retain the quality of the matte painting, without the matte painting have to go through generations of duplication, the matte paintings would be added as the last exposure in a completed shot. And so the last exposure would be onto dupe negative, not regular normal cinematic negative. And so Matthew had learned to transpose all these colors in his head and paint matte paintings that he knew green would turn into blue, or orange would turn into red, or yellow would turn into green, or whatever. He could paint these paintings that of themselves looked horrible, but exposed onto the dupe stock just looked like magic.
Of course, what that does is save a generation, going straight from the dupe stock to the screen.
Now, with the paintings themselves, on the case of Blade Runner, they were about 3 by 6 feet in dimension, and you can paint with certain size brushes and loose enough so that the camera doesn't see the brush strokes, and you can use broader strokes and actually get away with it.
Well, there's a kind of a natural blurriness to live action photography of real things. If you actually analyze a motion picture photograph of a building or a horizon or in the sky or clouds or whatever, it's always kind of a little bit blurry.
The straight lines aren't really straight. If you go stand next to a pillar or next to the detail or the texture of something is lost. If you paint so sharp and so perfect on something in scale, it comes back that way and it doesn't look real. So it's just the texture and light.
And so there was always a little bit of what we call stumbling or blurring to just soften the edges of the painting, to just make it kind of fall back into the scene.
They're like really not paintings in this film. There's portions of paintings, and some shot might have had 5 or 6 paintings where the section was burnt in that could have been fluorescence. Well, in the Tyrell office, there was a painting for the exterior where the pyramid had to be finished going up. But Ridley wanted to backlight it, of course, as it should have been. The sun ball was directly out. And when you shoot from projection, you never backlight because you're lighting into the beam splitter, and it flares everything and washes it out. So it was a very nervous time.
The whole top third of the frame is a oil matte paint, and passes. The sun was put in on a subsequent machine called COMSI, which we would then take an optical and do a little hold out for the wing of the pyramid and burn it in. And Matt Jurisic, who was doing the painting, would know that, okay, there's a bright light there, so he would work the rest of it out to all fit. But a lot of that was recreated. The pillars were extended up, the ceiling was added in matte painting.
The the shots all came together real well. I really like seeing Sean walk through the sunball because it was all rotoscoped, and it was a very scary shot. It's a beautiful shot. It's my favorite in the film. And you watch the film and you know it's an effect, but you just don't perceive it as an effect. You're in the Terrell Corporation office, and you just fall into it.
So I really wants you to meet Philip Dick, and can you come down and see it?
And I knew what I had, he'd love. So I took him down to see Rush's one day in Santa Monica.
We did a little show and tell. Most of our miniature photography was over at that time, and we drug out a few things and showed him. And he's very polite, nice man. We went through everything. He's very reserved. He asked a few questions. We politely answered. We went into the screening room, and Katie had said, just tie together 10 minutes of your better shots and run them. So the Vangelis music started to play. The seats started to rumble, and we ran through the thing. The lights came back up. Philip Dick turned around and looked right through the back of my head, and he said, how is this possible? How did this happen? It's like you guys hardwired my brain. That's what I saw when I was writing that story. I don't understand this. How could this happen?
And the compliment came when he said, and by the way, could you run that reel for me again? I want to see it once more. So he asked him to rerun the thing, and I'm told that he enjoyed it very much.
He was completely blown away, could not believe it. That something so serious was happening with his book, and we were friends thereafter.
When I think about it now, in comparison to what we're doing today with computers and everything, the Doug did was just amazing.
Everything was really done, because you can feel that when you watch a film. I think when you see a film and it's an in-camera effect, it feels real.
We were all very impressed with the work in Blade Runner, and to this day, I think that it's a high watermark, and the work, for the most part, still stands up very well.
Same thing that happened because I knew and we knew how few visual effects shots we had in the movie compared to Star Wars or Close Encounters or anybody else's, big effects movies. It was like a third of the number of shots. But the fact that the effect shots didn't stick out like a sore thumb, they were just integrated into this big, amazing event. That it seemed like there were more effect shots than there were. It was very pleasing to see it, fit together so seamlessly.
You take a look at how these images were expanding the story, and everyone on our crew, they got it. My whole team got it. They got it